The plane was packed as Flight 297 taxied down the runway, bound for a long journey from New York to Los Angeles. Among the passengers, in a back row, sat Jackson Cole, his headphones on and a paperback book resting on his lap. Unlike many agents, Jackson preferred jeans and a t-shirt over a suit, making it easy to blend in, which was crucial for his line of work. This was supposed to be a simple, uneventful trip, a chance for Jackson to unwind before his next assignment. But the air in the cabin held an odd tension, as though a storm were brewing beneath the hum of the engines. A loud, haughty voice cut through Jackson's thoughts. A woman in first class, dressed in designer clothes and dripping with jewelry, was loudly berating the flight attendant. Her shrill complaints about seat space, legroom, and the temperature filled the cabin, drawing uneasy glances from passengers nearby. Jackson noticed the flight attendants exchanging nervous looks, clearly accustomed to dealing with high-maintenance passengers. But this woman, Elaine, a name she emphasized repeatedly, was relentless, her complaints echoing over everyone else's quiet conversations. For a moment, Jackson thought about intervening. Years of FBI training had taught him how to diffuse tense situations, but he decided to let it go. He didn't want attention or unnecessary drama. His plan was simple: stay quiet, read his book, and get to Los Angeles without incident. However, not long into the flight, the situation escalated. Jackson heard Elaine's voice rising again, this time much closer. She'd gotten out of her first-class seat and was walking toward the back of the plane, her eyes sweeping over the passengers with an air of disdain. Then, suddenly, her gaze landed on him. She stopped in the aisle, looking him up and down with a contemptuous sneer, as if she'd found something particularly unpleasant in her line of sight. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice piercing. "You need to sit down. You're blocking the aisle." Jackson looked up, momentarily confused. He wasn't even standing in the aisle, just stretching near his seat. "Ma'am, I'm not in the aisle," he replied, keeping his voice calm. "Don't you ma'am me," Elaine retorted, loud enough for other passengers to turn and watch. "I've been watching you since you boarded. Acting like you own the place, strutting around. This isn't your neighborhood, you know." Jackson's jaw clenched, but he kept his composure. He dealt with people like her before, entitled, arrogant, oblivious to the effect of their words. The phrase "your neighborhood" hung in the air, thick with underlying venom. He took a deep breath, knowing he couldn't let this escalate. But Elaine wasn't about to let it go. Her voice grew louder as she leaned closer, her expression a mix of disdain and righteous indignation. "People like you always think you can get away with anything, don't you?" she sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "Do you even belong on this plane? Or are you just here to cause trouble?" The words hit Jackson like a slap. He'd faced prejudice before, but in the close confines of an airplane, surrounded by strangers, it felt different. More personal, more isolating. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, some filled with sympathy, others with discomfort, as they avoided looking directly at the confrontation unfolding before them. "Ma'am, I'm just trying to fly like everyone else," Jackson replied, his voice calm but firm. "Please don't turn this into something it doesn't need to be." But Elaine wasn't listening. She crossed her arms, glaring at him with a look of pure hatred. "People like you always play the victim," she spat, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think the world owes you something, don't you?" Jackson took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't let her provoke him. Not here, not now. But he could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, the urge to defend himself, to stand up to her. He'd been taught to handle volatile situations with composure, but this was different. This was personal. Suddenly, a young woman seated a few rows ahead leaned over to the flight attendant, her voice filled with frustration. "Are you going to do something about this?" she demanded, her eyes blazing with anger. "This is getting out of hand." The flight attendant looked frazzled, clearly uncertain about how to handle the situation. She glanced nervously between Elaine and Jackson, as if weighing her options, before finally stepping forward. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," she said, her voice firm but respectful. "We don't want to cause a disturbance." Elaine turned on the flight attendant, her face contorted with fury. "Don't you dare tell me what to do," she snapped. I paid good money for this seat, and I won't have people like him ruining my flight." She cast a venomous glance at Jackson, as if he were a stain she wanted to scrub away. The flight attendant looked helpless, caught between her duty to maintain order and the unruly passenger before her. Jackson could see the fear in her eyes, the hesitation that came with not wanting to make things worse. But he couldn't just stand there in silence any longer. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I haven't done anything to you. I suggest you sit down and enjoy your flight." Elaine's eyes flared with rage, her fists clenching at her sides. "Don't tell me what to do," she screamed, her voice breaking with anger. "People like you are the reason this country is going downhill." The entire cabin had gone silent, everyone watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Jackson felt the weight of every gaze on him, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. He took a slow breath, willing himself to stay calm, to not let her get under his skin. A man sitting in the row behind Jackson stood up, his voice cutting through the tension. "Lady, you need to calm down," he said firmly, his tone filled with quiet authority. "You're out of line." Elaine whipped around, her face a mask of fury. "Don't you dare tell me to calm down," she snapped. "I'm the one being harassed here." The man shook his head in disbelief. "You're not the one being harassed. Look around. No one's on your side." Several other passengers nodded in agreement, murmurs of support filling the cabin. Elaine's face flushed with anger, but she wasn't backing down. Instead, she doubled down, her voice growing louder as she addressed the entire plane. "You're all just jealous because I'm not afraid to speak the truth," she declared, her eyes blazing with righteous indignation. "People like him are the reason we can't have nice things anymore." Jackson clenched his fists at his sides, the urge to defend himself almost overwhelming. But he knew that engaging with her would only make things worse. He had to stay calm, to not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. But the situation felt like it was spiraling out of control, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold back. Then, just as things seemed like they were reaching a boiling point, a commanding voice rang out from the front of the plane. "Ma'am, you need to sit down, now." The pilot had come out of the cockpit, his expression one of calm authority. His voice was steady, unwavering, and it immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the cabin. Elaine turned toward the pilot, her mouth opening to argue, but before she could say anything, he raised a hand. "This behavior will not be tolerated on this flight," he said firmly. "Either you sit down and stop causing a disturbance, or we will have to take further action." For the first time, Elaine hesitated, glancing around the cabin as if realizing for the first time that she was alone in her outrage. The passengers around her were staring at her with disgust, their faces filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She crossed her arms, glaring at Jackson with a look of pure disdain. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath, her voice filled with venom. But she sank back into her seat, finally silenced, at least for the moment. Jackson took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing of his heart. The tension in the cabin was still palpable, but at least for now it seemed like the immediate threat had passed. He glanced around, noticing the sympathetic looks from some of the passengers, the nods of encouragement. It was a small comfort, but it helped to ease the sting of her words. The rest of the flight passed in a tense silence, Elaine occasionally muttering under her breath, her eyes filled with hatred as she cast furtive glances in Jackson's direction. But she didn't say anything more, perhaps cowed by the pilot's warning, or perhaps simply biding her time. As the plane finally began its descent, the announcement of landing filled the cabin with a sense of relief. Passengers began gathering their belongings, adjusting their seats, and preparing for the end of the flight. Jackson hoped that would be the end of it, that he could simply disembark and put this experience behind him. But Elaine had other plans. The moment the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign turned off, Elaine shot up from her seat, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and triumph. She marched to the front of the plane, cutting in front of other passengers who were still gathering their belongings. "I need to speak to the pilot," she demanded, her voice echoing through the cabin. Elaine's sharp demand sliced through the hum of passengers disembarking, leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake. Her self-righteous fury was palpable as she planted herself firmly at the front of the plane, arms crossed like a gatekeeper. "I need to speak with the pilot," she repeated, louder this time, her voice edged with frustration that her demands weren't instantly obeyed. The lead flight attendant quickly intercepted her, stepping in front of Elaine with a calm but firm expression. "Ma'am, please, there's no need to disrupt the disembarking process. We'll be able to help you with any concerns after you exit the aircraft." Elaine shook her head, an exaggerated expression of disbelief crossing her face. No, you don't understand. This is a matter of safety," she said, casting an accusatory glance back at Jackson, who was still calmly waiting for his turn to leave. "He needs to be investigated. Now." The flight attendant's eyes widened slightly, understanding dawning as she glanced back at Jackson. But Jackson's composed expression, his calm and patient stance seemed to reassure her. Turning back to Elaine, she replied, "Ma'am, please take your concerns to security if you must. But for now, please let everyone else disembark." Yet Elaine wasn't moving. She had her target and wouldn't relent. "I am doing everyone a favor," she said, her voice growing louder, trying to gather support from the lingering passengers. But instead of rallying behind her, the passengers around Jackson exchanged weary, sympathetic glances with him. Some people whispered to one another, shaking their heads at the absurdity of Elaine's behavior. Just as it seemed the standoff would drag on indefinitely, the captain himself finally emerged from the cockpit, his expression one of polite but firm authority. "Ma'am, I believe you were informed that this behavior will not be tolerated," he said, crossing his arms. His tone was resolute. "We have a schedule to keep. Please allow the other passengers to disembark." Elaine's face reddened, clearly frustrated that her demands were being denied, but she glanced around and saw nothing but disapproving faces. Still, she dug in her heels, her voice growing even more shrill, louder, as she addressed the entire cabin once more. "I don't understand why nobody here sees what I see," she cried, pointing toward Jackson, who remained silent, watching her with a steady gaze. "This is a man who's hiding something. I mean, look at him. Doesn't anyone else find it odd that he's sitting there so calm, so—" Jackson stood up, cutting her off with a quiet but unmistakable presence that silenced the cabin. He turned, looking Elaine directly in the eye, and with a steady, patient voice, he said, "Ma'am, I assure you, I am exactly who I need to be, and I am doing exactly what needs to be done." His words, simple yet unwavering, seemed to hang in the air, silencing Elaine's rant and drawing the attention of the remaining passengers. Elaine opened her mouth to retort, but something in Jackson's gaze held her in place, and she found herself speechless, perhaps for the first time since the start of the flight. "Excuse me," a quiet voice spoke from nearby. It was a young man seated just a few rows up. He had been watching the ordeal, his brows knit with tension, but his tone was gentle as he looked between Jackson and Elaine. "Look, I don't know about anyone else, but I'd feel safer with a guy like him on this plane over, well, whatever this whole thing is." A few people around him nodded in agreement, and another passenger murmured, "Exactly," under their breath. A ripple of agreement moved through the cabin, like a spark igniting a long-dormant flame of unity. Jackson, glancing around, could feel the passengers rallying around him, tired of the disruption, tired of the hatred that Elaine seemed intent on fueling. He took a quiet breath, inwardly grateful, but his outward calm remained unshaken. But Elaine wasn't done. Embarrassment flared on her face as she noticed the shift in the cabin's mood. Yet she stood her ground. "You're all just too afraid to say what you're really thinking," she huffed. "You'll regret it when it's too late." Just then, Jackson heard the low hum of walkie-talkies and turned to see two airport security officers boarding the plane. The lead flight attendant had discreetly called for assistance, and now the officers approached with a calm but purposeful demeanor, their eyes scanning the situation. Elaine spotted them immediately, a victorious grin crossing her face. She straightened, clearly relieved, and pointed emphatically toward Jackson. "Officers, you're here just in time," she said, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "That man over there, he's suspicious, he's dangerous. You should question him before he puts all of us at risk." The security officers exchanged a quick glance, assessing the situation, before one of them approached Jackson. His voice was measured, careful, as he spoke. "Sir, would you mind coming with us for a moment? We've been told there was a situation on this flight." Jackson nodded, his face neutral, and stood up, gathering his things with a composed demeanor. He felt the weight of the cabin's silence, the eyes of every passenger watching, some filled with concern, others with barely concealed outrage at Elaine's behavior. As he walked toward the officers, Elaine smirked, practically preening with the thrill of her perceived victory. "I told you all," she said triumphantly, her voice carrying through the cabin. "He was trouble from the beginning." But Jackson remained silent, his gaze steady. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his badge, and handed it to the lead officer, who examined it closely. The officer's eyes widened slightly as he read the title etched into the badge, Special Agent Jackson Cole, FBI. The officer handed the badge back to Jackson with a look of respect. "Thank you, Agent Cole. Sorry for the misunderstanding." Elaine's triumphant expression froze, her smile fading as confusion and panic flashed across her face. She stammered, her eyes darting between Jackson and the officer, as if trying to reconcile what she had just witnessed with the accusations she'd been spewing. "Wait, what?" she choked out, barely able to comprehend. "He's FBI?" Jackson turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. "Yes, ma'am, I'm an FBI agent on official duty, and I assure you I posed no danger to you or anyone else on this plane." Elaine's face drained of color as the realization settled in. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "I didn't know, I just thought." Jackson met her gaze, and for the first time his voice held a quiet steel. "You didn't think, you assumed." His words were soft but piercing, each syllable landing with the weight of the truth she'd ignored. Passengers murmured among themselves, exchanging knowing glances, some shaking their heads at her blatant ignorance and prejudice. A few of them nodded to Jackson, showing quiet solidarity and respect. Elaine's embarrassment was palpable. She looked around the cabin, her cheeks flushed, eyes darting away from the cold glares and disappointed stares of the passengers. She'd started this ordeal with such confidence, convinced she was doing everyone a favor. Now, she was the villain in her own story, and there was no escaping it. The lead security officer gave Elaine a final, assessing glance. "Ma'am," he said, his voice laced with professionalism yet unmistakably firm, "I believe you should disembark now and let everyone else leave in peace." Elaine, defeated, could only nod, unable to meet anyone's gaze. She shuffled off the plane, shoulders hunched, her once commanding presence now shrunk to the size of her own humiliation. As Elaine shuffled off the plane, the remaining passengers exhaled in quiet relief. But the momentary calm was short-lived. Just as Jackson began gathering his belongings to finally leave, a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, stepped into the aisle, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. He tugged on his mother's sleeve, whispering loudly, "Mom, is he a real-life hero?" Jackson couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth. The mother shot Jackson an apologetic look but smiled back, nodding slightly at her son. Jackson knelt down, meeting the boy's gaze with a warm, reassuring expression. "Hey there," he said quietly. "Sometimes doing the right thing means staying calm, even when people aren't nice." The boy's eyes sparkled with admiration. "I want to be like you when I grow up," he said, voice filled with youthful sincerity. The comment, simple and innocent, touched Jackson in a way he hadn't anticipated. For a moment, he forgot the tension, the accusations, and the sting of Elaine's words. This was the reminder he needed, a reminder of the difference he aimed to make, not just as an agent, but as a person. Passengers nearby, having witnessed this exchange, looked on with softened expressions. A few of them began to approach Jackson, some offering small words of appreciation, others simply patting his shoulder or nodding in silent respect. "You handled that well, sir," a businessman in a crisp suit murmured, shaking Jackson's hand. "People like her. Well, we're lucky people like you know how to deal with them." Each gesture was small, but together they formed a quiet wave of support that washed away some of the bitterness left by Elaine's tirade. Jackson felt an unexpected swell of gratitude, and his silent composure softened. He realized that the impact of his restraint had extended beyond just diffusing the situation. He had shown these people that decency could rise above prejudice. As the passengers finally began to file out, Jackson trailed behind, grateful for the sense of closure that these moments had brought him. He was almost at the gate when a voice called his name, a voice he recognized instantly. It was Elaine, waiting just outside, her expression a confusing mixture of shame and defiance. She was standing alone, arms crossed, her face tight with tension. "Agent Cole," she began, her voice hesitant but tinged with the same condescension that had marked their earlier interaction. "Look, I didn't mean for things to go that far. I was just looking out for everyone. You have to understand that." She looked at him, hoping, it seemed, for some form of validation. Jackson held her gaze for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think you were looking out for yourself, not everyone else," he replied, his tone calm but resolute. "Sometimes it's easier to assume the worst about people who look different than you. But you don't know my story, and I don't know yours. Maybe next time, remember that." Elaine's expression shifted, the usual arrogance dimming as his words struck something deeper. She seemed almost ready to argue but then caught herself. Her lips pressed together tightly, and she simply looked away, unsure how to respond. Jackson could see the internal struggle, the first hint of doubt creeping into her expression. Then, as if on impulse, Elaine murmured, "I just thought I was helping. I was afraid." Jackson softened slightly, recognizing the glimmer of self-awareness in her eyes. "Fear can make us do things we wouldn't otherwise do, but so can prejudice." He paused, watching as the weight of his words settled over her, the faintest hint of understanding dawning in her eyes. "Take care, ma'am," he said quietly before walking away, leaving her to stand alone with her thoughts. But as he approached the exit, a surprise awaited. Several airport staff, including the security officers who had escorted Elaine off the plane, were gathered near the gate. One of them, a tall, no-nonsense woman in a crisp uniform, approached him with a professional but warm expression. "Agent Cole," she began, extending her hand. "We're grateful for your composure back there. Not many people handle situations like that with as much patience as you did." Jackson nodded, shaking her hand, his gratitude unspoken but evident. "Thank you," he replied simply. Another staff member piped up, "You know, we don't always get to see good examples of how people should treat each other, especially in high-stress situations." It was refreshing, to say the least. He looked around at his colleagues, who nodded in agreement, and Jackson felt a surprising warmth from the unexpected support. As Jackson continued down the airport corridor, feeling both mentally exhausted and strangely buoyed, he couldn't shake the sense that something fundamental had shifted. Elaine's actions had been a glaring reminder of the prejudice he still faced. But the reactions of everyone else, especially the passengers and staff who'd chosen to show him respect, had reinforced his belief in the power of quiet resilience. As he reached the airport entrance, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked the screen, and a familiar name popped up. His supervisor, Director Mallory. The message was brief, but it made Jackson smile. "Job well done, Cole. You've reminded us all what it means to be an agent." Jackson tucked his phone away, looking out at the bustling city beyond the airport doors, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Today had been a test of patience, of strength, of character, and he had passed. But it wasn't just about him, it was about the quiet reminder he'd left behind. Sometimes the most powerful acts aren't the loudest. Sometimes they're the ones you carry in silence. Jackson stood there for a moment, letting the city's hum settle over him like a familiar blanket, grounding him after the turbulence of the flight. But as he took a deep breath, a voice called out his name again, this time hesitant, almost apologetic. He turned to see Elaine, of all people, walking towards him, her steps slow and uncertain. She clutched her purse tightly, her gaze cast downward. It was a stark contrast to the confident, demanding woman he'd encountered on the plane. "Agent Cole," she began, her voice softer now, void of the shrill edge that had dominated their earlier interactions. I know you don't owe me any of your time, and I don't even know why I'm here right now, but..." She paused, as if searching for the right words. "I felt like I couldn't just leave things like this." Jackson raised an eyebrow, his face neutral as he studied her. The other airport staff were watching them from a respectful distance, and he noticed the faint concern in their eyes, like they were ready to step in if things went awry. But Jackson remained calm, crossing his arms as he waited for her to continue. Elaine hesitated, her expression flickering with frustration, as if she was grappling with emotions she didn't fully understand. Look, what I did back there, on the plane, it wasn't right. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting people. But she faltered, her voice trailing off as she looked away. Jackson's expression softened, if only slightly. It was clear that this wasn't easy for her, that she was facing a moment of reckoning. He didn't interrupt, letting the silence stretch, giving her the space to sort through her thoughts. Finally, she looked back at him, her eyes holding a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. I always thought I was the kind of person who would do the right thing, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But today, I realized that maybe I don't know myself as well as I thought. Jackson nodded slowly, understanding. Sometimes it takes facing ourselves in the mirror of someone else's eyes to see who we really are. He replied gently, It's not easy, but if it helps, I believe we all have the capacity to change. The question is whether we want to. Elaine's face shifted, a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She seemed almost grateful for his words, though she still looked conflicted. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said, her voice unsteady. But I do want to say thank you for not making it worse, for showing me a side of myself that I couldn't see. Jackson gave her a small nod, sensing the depth of what she was trying to convey, even if she didn't fully understand it herself. Acknowledging it is a start. He said simply, The rest is up to you. She stood there for a moment, as if weighing his words before giving him a faint nod. Thank you, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her steps measured and contemplative. Jackson watched her go, feeling a surprising mix of emotions. He didn't know if Elaine would take this moment and change, or if she'd slip back into her old patterns. But he knew that, for a brief moment, she had been forced to confront herself. And sometimes, that was all it took to spark a transformation. As he turned to finally head out of the airport, he spotted the young boy from earlier, watching him with wide eyes, standing with his mother a few feet away. When Jackson met his gaze, the boy smiled shyly and gave him a small thumbs up, his face lighting up with admiration. Mom, he's like a superhero, the boy exclaimed, loud enough for Jackson to hear. His mother smiled warmly, nodding in agreement as she gently nudged her son to wave goodbye. Jackson returned the wave, chuckling softly. The boy's innocent excitement warmed his heart, a refreshing reminder of the impact he could have, not just as an agent, but as a person. It was a simple moment, but it grounded him, reminding him of why he did what he did. Just as he was about to leave, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from his partner, Special Agent Lisa Torres, who had worked alongside him on numerous cases. He answered, and her familiar voice greeted him with a touch of humor. Cole, you sure know how to stir things up, she teased, clearly aware of the ordeal he'd just endured. I heard there was some kind of incident on your flight. Everything okay? Jackson smiled, his voice warm with relief. All good, Torres. Just another day of dealing with the unexpected. How's everything on your end? Lisa chuckled. Not as eventful as yours, apparently. I have a feeling you'll be the talk of the office for a while. Her voice softened. But seriously, I'm glad you're okay. You've always had a way of keeping your cool in tough situations. I don't know how you do it. Jackson shrugged, even though she couldn't see him. I guess it's just part of the job. Besides, I had a few unexpected allies on that flight. There was a pause on the other end before Lisa replied, her tone thoughtful. Sometimes that's all it takes. A few people standing up to remind us that we're not alone. She paused, and Jackson could almost see her smiling. Anyway, when you're back, we've got a briefing on a new case. Think you'll be up for it? Always, Jackson replied, his tone resolute. See you soon, Torres. As he ended the call, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready. Jackson slipped his phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath, feeling the coolness of the city air settle over him. The airport lights cast a warm glow as the evening descended, and he began making his way towards the taxi stand. As he approached, a black sedan pulled up beside him. The window rolled down, and to his surprise, a familiar face grinned at him from the driver's seat. It was his partner, Agent Lisa Torres. Need a ride? She asked, her eyes twinkling with amusement. Lisa was as sharp as they came, and her humor often surfaced in unexpected ways, especially when Jackson was least expecting it. She leaned over and opened the passenger door, nodding for him to get in. Figured you could use some company after the day you've had. Jackson laughed, shaking his head as he climbed into the car. I appreciate it, Torres. But how did you even know I'd be here? She shrugged, pulling away from the curb with a playful smirk. Let's just say word travels fast when an agent ends up being the hero on a commercial flight. Apparently, you've become something of a legend back at the office. Jackson raised an eyebrow, both amused and mildly exasperated. Great, exactly what I needed, an entire office of agents poking fun at my in-flight heroics. Lisa chuckled, giving him a side glance. Heroics? All I heard was that you kept your cool while some lady with a superiority complex tried to take you down. But from what I heard, the passengers seemed to think you handled it like a pro. Besides, she added, more serious now, sometimes those situations are harder than any case. They're personal. Jackson nodded, letting her words sink in. There was truth to it. The emotional toll of the encounter, of confronting someone's raw prejudice while staying composed, had been challenging, but he was also grateful. Grateful that others had stood up, and grateful to have a partner who understood. They drove in companionable silence for a while, the city lights flickering past the windows. But then Lisa spoke, her tone quieter, more thoughtful. You know, Jackson, these encounters can hit harder than we realize. They make us question things, make us wonder if we're really making a difference. She glanced over at him, her expression sincere. I think what you did today reminded a lot of people that they can make a difference, even in small ways. Jackson looked out the window, considering her words. Maybe, he said, his voice contemplative. But it's a reminder, too, of how far we still have to go. Moments like these, they don't always end well. She nodded, a soft sigh escaping her. That's true. But the difference is you've given people a story where they saw someone stand tall, someone who didn't back down or respond with hate. Sometimes those stories stay with people. As the car wound its way through the streets, Jackson felt a sense of calm settling over him, a reassurance that, despite the challenges, there was value in each small act, each moment of resilience. But their quiet moment was interrupted as Lisa's phone buzzed, and her expression shifted immediately to one of focus. She answered, exchanging a few words before her face turned serious. Looks like we're not quite done for the night, she said, ending the call and giving Jackson a look that was both determined and slightly apologetic. That new case we talked about earlier, it just took an urgent turn. We're needed at HQ, now. Without a second's hesitation, Jackson sat up straighter, his mind already switching gears. He didn't know what awaited them, but he trusted Lisa and their team. They had tackled countless cases together, each one demanding something different, each one testing their skills in ways they never expected. As they made their way back to the office, Jackson couldn't help but feel a strange sense of readiness. The events of the day had shaken him, yes, but they had also reminded him of the resilience he'd built over the years, a resilience he could bring to this new case, whatever it might entail. When they finally pulled up to HQ, the building loomed tall against the night sky, its lights bright and unyielding, a beacon calling them back to duty. They entered together, walking down the familiar hallways, where their colleagues threw Jackson a few curious glances, clearly aware of his earlier ordeal. But there was no time to linger on that now. They were ushered straight into the briefing room, where their team leader, Director Mallory, stood waiting. The director's expression was serious, his tone brisk as he launched into an explanation of their new mission. Agents Cole Torres, thank you for coming in on such short notice. This case is high stakes and it just became urgent. We have a situation involving a suspected human trafficking ring that's eluded us for months, and we just received intel that could lead to a critical break. Jackson exchanged a quick glance with Lisa, both of them immediately understanding the gravity of the case. Director Mallory continued, explaining how they would need to go undercover, gathering intelligence on a suspected operation located in the outskirts of the city. The mission would be risky, but the potential to dismantle such an operation made it worth the cost. As they absorbed the details, Jackson felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the kind of work that mattered most to him, the chance to protect lives, to bring justice where it was needed. Whatever frustrations or doubts he'd felt earlier that day seemed to dissolve, replaced by a clear, steadfast resolve. Mallory looked at both of them, his voice softer now. I know this is a big ask, especially given the day you've already had, but I need agents I can trust on this. People who don't just do the job, they live it. Jackson gave a nod, feeling the weight of those words. We're ready, Director. Lisa, standing beside him, gave a nod of her own. You can count on us. As they left the briefing room, they both felt the gravity of what lay ahead. This case was more than just a mission. It was a calling, a chance to make a real difference. As Jackson and Lisa left the briefing room, the air felt thick with purpose. Their mission was more than just another assignment. It was a high-stakes operation with lives on the line. They moved swiftly down the dimly lit corridor toward the equipment room, where they would gear up for the undercover mission. Lisa glanced over at Jackson as she checked her firearm and tactical gear, a wry smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Did you think you'd be back in action this fast after that flight? Jackson smirked, shaking his head. I thought my biggest challenge today was going to be dealing with a Karen in first class. Shows what I know. Lisa chuckled, but her eyes held a seriousness that mirrored his own. They had faced a lot together, and Jackson knew that with her by his side, they could handle whatever came next. With their equipment in place, they ran over the details one last time, mentally preparing for the undercover roles they would take on. They'd be posing as clients looking to buy exclusive assets, a ruse to get them into the heart of the trafficking ring. The car ride to the meeting point was tense, each of them lost in thought, rehearsing their roles and the plan. As they approached their destination, a dimly lit, run-down warehouse on the city outskirts, Jackson felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a monolithic reminder of the dangers within. It was a place of shadows, where people were trafficked like commodities, where lives were stolen in silence. They parked a safe distance away, using an unmarked car provided by the agency. Before they exited, Lisa placed a hand on Jackson's shoulder, her expression uncharacteristically somber. Hey, let's keep our guard up. These guys are ruthless, and if things go south, we'll need to get out fast. Jackson nodded, meeting her gaze. Always, Taurus, we're in this together. They stepped out of the car and approached the warehouse, each movement deliberate and calculated. The inside was as bleak as they had imagined. Harsh fluorescent lights flickered over old crates, casting an eerie glow. A group of men, clearly guards, waited by the entrance, their eyes hard and suspicious. One of them stepped forward, sizing up Jackson and Lisa, his gaze lingering just a moment too long. Names? He grunted. Jackson, slipping effortlessly into his undercover role, gave a curt nod, his voice steady and cold. Carter and Jenna, he replied, giving their fake names with a confidence that only came from years of experience. We were told you had what we were looking for. The guard's eyes narrowed, but he waved them through. They stepped further into the warehouse, and what they saw only deepened their resolve. Several rooms led off from the main area, each guarded, with nervous figures moving within. Jackson caught glimpses of individuals huddled in corners, eyes wide with fear. They were victims, trafficked and stripped of their freedom. Jackson felt a familiar knot of anger and sadness tightening in his chest. He looked over at Lisa, who returned his gaze, her jaw set with the same steely determination. But they had to be cautious. One wrong move and they'd be compromised. As they waited, a wiry man in a sharp suit approached, introducing himself as Marcus, one of the brokers for the operation. His voice was oily and self-assured, a practiced tone that spoke of years in the business of exploiting lives. He eyed Jackson and Lisa appraisingly, a faint smirk on his lips. So, you're the ones looking for investments? Marcus's voice dripped with smug arrogance, as though he were offering them some luxurious product instead of human beings. Jackson played along, feigning interest, his voice cold and businesslike. We're here for something unique, something with potential. His words were a calculated attempt to match Marcus's twisted language, though it took every ounce of willpower to keep the disgust out of his voice. Marcus's smirk widened as he gestured for them to follow him down a narrow corridor. "Right this way. We have a few options for your consideration." He led them toward a room at the end of the hall, guarded by another man who stepped aside to let them in. Inside, Jackson's heart wrenched. There were 6 people inside, each looking terrified, clutching one another for comfort. Their hollow eyes stared up at him and Lisa, their expressions a mixture of despair and faint hope, as if they sensed something different in the 2 agents standing before them. Lisa glanced at Jackson, her eyes filled with the same rage and resolve he felt in his own heart. They had to proceed carefully. Any sign of recognition, any hint of empathy, could give them away. Jackson kept his face cold, nodding slightly as though he were appraising merchandise. Marcus, oblivious to their true intentions, continued with sickening pride. "You won't find a more compliant group," he said, his tone smug. "They're all ready to be trained as you see fit." Jackson's fists clenched imperceptibly, but he managed to keep his voice even. "And what are the arrangements? Payment? Delivery?" Marcus's eyes gleamed with greed as he began outlining the details, gesturing to a nearby desk covered in files and documents. Jackson's gaze drifted over the paperwork, catching glimpses of ledgers, transaction records, and transportation logs, evidence that could blow this operation wide open. Lisa, sensing the opportunity, turned to Marcus with a casual question, skillfully drawing his attention away. "And what kind of protection do you have in place here?" she asked, her voice cool but interested. "I imagine security must be tight, given the nature of your work." Marcus straightened, a flash of pride in his eyes as he launched into a detailed explanation of their security protocols. Jackson took the chance to subtly edge closer to the desk, slipping a small device from his pocket. A miniature camera designed to capture documents quickly and efficiently. As Marcus continued talking, Jackson discreetly snapped photos, capturing every piece of incriminating evidence in sight. But just as he took the final shot, one of the guards entered the room, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of Jackson's hand near the desk. "What are you doing?" the guard barked, his tone laced with suspicion. Jackson's mind raced, and without missing a beat, he turned to Marcus, his expression darkening with mock irritation. "Is this how you conduct business? Letting your guards question your clients?" His voice was low, filled with just enough indignation to sell the act. Marcus, caught off guard by Jackson's response, turned on the guard with an annoyed glare. "Watch your tone," he snapped. "These are clients, not criminals. Apologize." The guard hesitated, casting a wary glance at Jackson, but he finally muttered an apology and backed away. Jackson's heart pounded, but he maintained his calm demeanor, giving Marcus a curt nod. "I expect more discretion if we're going to continue with this deal." Marcus quickly nodded, eager to smooth things over. Of course, there won't be any more interruptions." But just as they thought the situation was under control, a loud noise echoed from outside the room, a crash followed by the sounds of hurried footsteps and shouts. Marcus's eyes darted toward the door, his face contorting with anger. What now? The tension in the room spiked, and Jackson and Lisa exchanged a quick glance. This wasn't part of the plan. Something had gone wrong. Marcus, looking furious, barked an order to the guards, who immediately left the room to investigate. Jackson and Lisa seized the opportunity, inching closer to the group of captives huddled in the corner. Keeping his voice low, Jackson whispered, "We're here to help. Stay calm. And when we give the signal, follow our lead." The fear in their eyes softened into faint glimmers of hope as they nodded, their hands gripping one another tightly. But before they could move, Marcus turned back to them, his suspicion rekindling. "I'm not so sure about you two," he muttered, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer. He studied their faces with growing distrust, his gaze flicking between Jackson and Lisa, trying to read the truth beneath their composed facades. In that moment, Jackson realized they had no choice. The mission was compromised. Marcus's suspicious gaze lingered on Jackson and Lisa, his brow furrowing as he took a slow, deliberate step toward them. In that split second, Jackson sensed they were teetering on the edge of exposure, every nerve in his body primed for action. He shot Lisa a subtle look, a silent communication honed through years of partnership. If Marcus took one more step, they'd have to act. But before Marcus could say anything further, the door burst open, and one of the guards staggered in, his face pale. "Boss," he stammered, trying to catch his breath. "The cops, they're here. They're surrounding the place." The room descended into chaos. Marcus's face darkened with a fierce scowl as he turned on the guard. "How could you let this happen?" he barked, fury flashing in his eyes. He quickly shifted gears, waving frantically to the remaining guards. "Lock down the exits. No one leaves until we've cleaned this up." Jackson and Lisa seized the moment of confusion. Jackson leaned in close to the terrified group of captives, his voice low but firm. "Stay close and be ready to move. We'll get you out of here." Lisa, ever alert, began scanning the room for possible exits, while Jackson moved subtly to shield the captives. They were operating on sheer instinct now, the plan unraveling as the seconds ticked by. As guards rushed around to secure the building, Marcus was distracted, barking orders to his men to destroy evidence, to cover up anything that could implicate him. Jackson knew time was slipping away. He and Lisa needed to get these people to safety before the entire place was locked down. Thinking quickly, he edged towards the door, motioning for Lisa to stay close. But Marcus's paranoia got the better of him. His gaze flicked back to Jackson and Lisa with a newfound suspicion, and his voice turned dangerously cold. "Wait, you two, who are you really?" His hand moved toward the gun tucked into his waistband. Jackson's cover was blown. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward, his voice steely. "FBI, step back and drop your weapon." Marcus's face twisted in a snarl, his pride giving way to raw anger. "You've made a huge mistake, Agent. You don't know who you're dealing with." But Jackson didn't flinch, his stance unwavering. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. You're done, Marcus." The tension in the room snapped as Marcus raised his gun, and Jackson's reflexes kicked in. He lunged forward, knocking the gun from Marcus's hand in a swift, practiced motion. A scuffle broke out, and Lisa was quick to step in, grabbing one of the guards who rushed toward them and disarming him in a flash. She moved with a fierce efficiency, taking down another guard who attempted to intervene. Amidst the struggle, Jackson managed to reach one of the captives, helping them to their feet. "Stay with us," he urged, guiding them towards the door. The others followed, and Jackson, with Lisa at his side, began leading them out, navigating the maze of hallways as gunfire erupted behind them. The building had erupted into chaos, with Marcus's remaining men scrambling to protect their operation. As they moved down a narrow corridor, they encountered a locked door blocking their escape route. Lisa quickly assessed the situation, turning to Jackson with a determined look. "I'll handle this," she said, and before Jackson could respond, she smashed a fire extinguisher into the lock, breaking it free with a loud clang. They pushed through, ushering the captives into a dimly lit stairwell that led to an emergency exit. But as they descended, Jackson's instincts kicked in, a feeling he'd learned to trust over years on the job. "Wait," he whispered, holding up a hand. Footsteps echoed up the stairwell from below, and Jackson knew they were out of time. He turned to Lisa. "We'll have to find another way." Just then, a young girl among the captives tugged on Jackson's sleeve. Her eyes wide but filled with an unexpected calm. "I know another way out," she whispered, her voice small but steady. Jackson crouched down, looking her in the eye. "Can you lead us there?" The girl nodded, her gaze unflinching. "I used to sneak out before they caught me." Without another word, Jackson gestured for the group to follow the girl as she led them through a narrow, unused corridor that seemed almost hidden within the maze of the warehouse. They moved quickly and quietly, the girl guiding them with surprising familiarity, her small footsteps steady as she navigated the twisting passageways. As they neared the exit, Jackson could hear the commotion outside, the wail of sirens, the muffled shouts of law enforcement preparing for entry. Relief surged through him, but they weren't out of danger yet. Lisa took the lead, peeking out the final doorway to assess the situation. "All clear," she mouthed back to Jackson, her eyes scanning the area. They filed out, the fresh air a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the warehouse. But just as they reached the open, Marcus appeared out of nowhere, his face twisted in rage, his gun drawn. "Not so fast," he hissed, leveling his weapon at Jackson. He looked ready to pull the trigger, his anger and desperation boiling over. Jackson held his ground, stepping forward slightly to shield the captives. "It's over, Marcus. Drop the gun." Marcus's hand trembled, and for a split second, Jackson saw the fear flicker in his eyes, the fear of a man who knew he'd lost everything. But before he could make his move, a voice rang out, clear and commanding. "Put the weapon down, Marcus." It was the young girl, her voice filled with a strength that belied her age. Her gaze was locked onto Marcus, defiant and unafraid. The sight seemed to rattle him, and in that instant of hesitation, Jackson seized the opportunity. He surged forward, disarming Marcus in one swift movement and knocking him to the ground. The other agents swarmed in, securing him as he was finally taken into custody. With Marcus subdued, Jackson turned back to the girl, who was watching the scene with a calm resilience that moved him deeply. "You did good," he said softly, his voice filled with genuine respect. "You were brave." The girl gave a small, hesitant smile, the faintest trace of relief beginning to soften her face. But the moment was short-lived as the reality of her ordeal settled over her, her eyes filling with unshed tears. Lisa knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," she said gently. "You're going home." As the police processed the scene, Jackson and Lisa stayed with the group of rescued captives, ensuring each one received medical attention and care. They had completed their mission, but the weight of the day lingered heavily. When the last of the survivors were taken to safety, Jackson glanced over at Lisa, exhaustion etched into his features, but a quiet pride shining in his eyes. They had done what they came to do, and for these survivors, it meant a new chance at life. Yet as they watched the last of the captives depart, Jackson's mind returned to the girl who had led them out, her bravery echoing in his thoughts. He knew her courage would stay with him, a reminder of the strength he fought to protect. It was moments like these that made every sacrifice, every challenge worth it. Lisa nudged him gently, breaking the silence. "Ready to go, hero?" Jackson chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Only if you are, partner." They walked back to their car, the night sky stretching wide and clear above them, feeling the weight of a hard-fought victory and the humbling reminder of what they stood for. And as they drove back to HQ, they knew that, for tonight, they had truly made a difference. As Jackson and Lisa drove back to HQ, a sense of satisfaction mixed with exhaustion settled over them. The night was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just left behind. But the drive wasn't silent for long. Jackson's phone buzzed, and he picked it up to see a message from Director Mallory. "Urgent briefing. Report back immediately." Lisa glanced over, reading the text as well, and raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think we'd be needed again so soon." Jackson shook his head, though a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "The work never stops, does it?" When they arrived at HQ, they went straight to the conference room where Mallory was waiting, his expression serious. A few other agents were already present, some whispering quietly, others looking over notes and documents with an intense focus. Mallory's gaze sharpened as he saw Jackson and Lisa enter. "Good, you're here," he said, motioning for them to take a seat. "I know it's been a long day for both of you, but this situation demands immediate attention. The operation tonight yielded more than just rescued captives. It's bigger, much bigger." Jackson and Lisa exchanged a glance, their fatigue fading as adrenaline kicked back in. The urgency in Mallory's tone told them that whatever lay ahead was critical. Mallory began to explain, displaying a series of images and documents on the screen behind him. As you know, Marcus wasn't just running a trafficking ring. He was part of a larger network, one that's spread across several countries and has ties to major organized crime groups. Our intel suggests that they're planning a major shipment, one that's set to happen within the next 48 hours. The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation settled over them. This wasn't just a local operation. It was an international network that threatened countless lives. Jackson leaned forward, his voice steady. "Where's the shipment set to take place?" Mallory's expression darkened. "We don't have an exact location yet, but we've managed to intercept some communication indicating it could happen along the coast. They're using old unmarked cargo ships, making it difficult to track. We need agents who are ready to go undercover and intercept that shipment before it disappears again." Lisa's gaze was fierce, unwavering. "Count us in. Whatever it takes, we'll do it." Mallory nodded, visibly relieved. "I knew I could count on you two." We're pulling together all available resources for this mission. You'll be working alongside international agents who've been tracking this network for years. They'll meet you at the drop site, but for now, you're leading this mission." The team dispersed to prepare, each agent gathering equipment and making quick tactical plans. Jackson and Lisa took a moment to go over the details, planning their approach and reviewing the layout of the coastal area where the drop was suspected to take place. As they loaded up their gear, a young agent, Callum, approached them, his face filled with admiration and determination. "Agents Cole, Taurus," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "I just wanted to say, what you did tonight with the rescue, it was inspiring, and I want to be part of this mission." Jackson gave him a measured look, recognizing the fire of a rookie agent, but also the inexperience behind his eyes. "This mission will be dangerous. Callum, you've read the file. We're dealing with heavily armed, organized criminals who won't hesitate to retaliate. This isn't the kind of operation you can jump into without serious preparation." Callum swallowed but nodded firmly. "I understand, sir, but I'm ready. I want to be part of something that matters." Jackson looked to Lisa, who gave a subtle nod of approval. "All right," Jackson said, clapping Callum on the shoulder. "Welcome to the team. Just remember, follow our lead, and keep your head down when things get rough." As they drove out toward the coast, Jackson briefed Callum on the mission details, going over each contingency and making sure he understood the stakes. The young agent listened intently, his gaze focused and serious, soaking up every word. By the time they arrived, the air was heavy with anticipation. They parked their vehicle a safe distance from the port and approached on foot, using the cover of night to remain unseen. The vast expanse of the ocean stretched out before them, the moonlight casting a silvery glow over the water. The international agents were already in position, concealed among the crates and abandoned shipping containers. Jackson and Lisa moved into place, signaling to their counterparts that they were ready. They watched as a large, rusted cargo ship approached the dock, its hull dark and unmarked. It moved slowly, ominously, and as it drew closer, they could make out figures on deck, men dressed in tactical gear, their weapons slung over their shoulders. Jackson's instincts told him these weren't ordinary guards. They were professionals, trained and ruthless. The agents waited, biding their time as the ship was secured at the dock. Men on the ground moved quickly, setting up barriers and positioning themselves strategically around the area. Jackson exchanged a look with Lisa. This wasn't going to be easy. The sheer number of guards meant that any slip-up would lead to a firefight. But then, something unexpected happened. Among the crowd of people emerging from the ship, Jackson spotted a familiar face, Marcus's right-hand man from the warehouse. The same man who had nearly exposed Jackson's cover. The sight of him here confirmed their worst suspicions. Marcus's network was even larger than they'd imagined, and this wasn't just one shipment. It was part of a well-coordinated operation. Jackson signaled to Lisa, who nodded. They adjusted their earpieces, contacting the other agents positioned nearby. "Change of plan," Jackson murmured into the mic. "Marcus's men are here. They've got reinforcements, and this is looking more fortified than we anticipated. We'll need to hit their weak points strategically, or we won't stand a chance." The international agents acknowledged the adjustment, each team coordinating to cover the exits and disable their communication lines. It was a delicate maneuver, but they were prepared. They'd only have one shot at this, and if they failed, the entire network might vanish before they could ever be stopped again. Jackson gave a final look to his team, his face set with determination. He raised his hand, signaling the countdown. 3, 2, 1. In a swift, synchronized movement, the agents moved in. Jackson and Lisa led the charge, disabling guards with quick, efficient moves, their training guiding them through the maze of cargo and shipping crates. Callum stayed close, his eyes sharp and focused as he followed Jackson's lead, moving with a controlled determination that impressed Jackson. As they neared the heart of the operation, they encountered Marcus's lieutenant, his face twisting into a sneer as he recognized Jackson. "You again," he spat, reaching for his weapon. But Jackson was faster. In a flash, he disarmed the man, pinning him against a shipping container as Lisa covered him, scanning for threats. The man struggled, his eyes blazing with defiance. You think taking me down will stop this? He sneered. You're too late. By tomorrow, the network will be operating somewhere else, with new faces, new leaders. You'll never stop us. Jackson leaned in, his voice low and unyielding. We'll see about that. Because every time we take down someone like you, we get closer, and eventually, your network will have nowhere left to hide. As they restrained him, Callum secured the perimeter, signaling that the other guards had been neutralized. They were nearly clear, but the mission wasn't over yet. They still needed to reach the ship's control room and secure any files, any leads that could reveal the network's deeper connections. Jackson and Lisa moved swiftly, navigating through narrow passageways on the ship until they found the control room. Inside, they located several files, each one filled with encrypted codes and aliases that hinted at something larger, a web of operations that stretched farther than they'd imagined. The realization hit them hard. This network wasn't just local or regional. It was a global machine, a well-oiled trafficking ring with layers of secrecy and countless hidden players. Jackson felt a grim determination settle over him. They were just beginning to uncover the extent of this operation, and they wouldn't stop until it was dismantled. Just as they secured the final piece of evidence, Jackson heard a faint sound, a voice from behind one of the doors. He motioned to Lisa, and they opened it to find a small room filled with people who had been detained, awaiting transport. The sight steeled his resolve even further. You're safe now, he assured them, his voice firm and gentle. One of the captives, a young man with tired eyes, looked at him with a glimmer of hope. Are you really here to stop all of this? Jackson nodded, his expression resolute. Yes, and we won't stop until it's done. As Jackson reassured the group of captives, he could feel the weight of their desperation and fear. Each face told a story of hardship, and he knew this mission had to be a turning point, not just a rescue, but the beginning of something bigger. A relentless pursuit to dismantle this global network. Lisa joined him, her expression resolute. Let's get them out of here, she murmured, her voice laced with compassion. With swift, practiced movements, they guided the captives out, moving quietly through the labyrinthine corridors of the ship. Outside, the other agents had secured the area, ensuring there were no more threats lingering in the shadows. The young man Jackson had spoken to earlier walked beside him, clutching a small bundle of belongings close to his chest. As they neared the exit, he turned to Jackson, his voice a hushed whisper. You don't know what this means to us. We thought no one knew, that no one cared. His eyes were brimming with gratitude, and Jackson's chest tightened at the emotion in his voice. We care, Jackson replied softly, meeting his gaze. And we're not stopping until every last one of you is safe. They made it back to the dock, where emergency personnel were waiting, ready to provide medical attention and care for the survivors. The young man looked back one last time, his face a mixture of relief and a lingering sadness. Jackson felt the gravity of that look, a silent plea that he took to heart. As the captives were led away, Jackson and Lisa regrouped with Callum and the other agents, each one marked by exhaustion, but driven by the victory they'd just achieved. Callum, still catching his breath, looked up at Jackson with newfound admiration. I can't believe we pulled it off, he said, his voice tinged with awe. Jackson gave him a slight nod, a small but genuine smile. You did well, Callum. You held your own. Callum grinned, the praise clearly lifting his spirits. Thanks, sir. I couldn't have asked for a better team. They all began moving back toward their vehicles, the weight of the mission finally settling in. Just as Jackson was about to get into the car, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Director Mallory. Agent Cole. Mallory's voice was steady, but there was a note of urgency. I have news. The intel you secured from the ship, it's already bearing fruit. We're tracking down their main communication hub, and we believe it's based in a high-security compound. This could be the nerve center of their entire operation. Jackson's heart leapt at the news. This was the breakthrough they'd been waiting for, the chance to strike at the heart of the network. He glanced at Lisa, who was listening intently, her expression sharpening with the same determination he felt. We're ready, Director, Jackson replied. Just give us the word. Mallory didn't hesitate. You're authorized to engage. We've identified the compound's location, and we need a team on site immediately. The compound is heavily guarded, so you'll be going in with a tactical squad. Expect resistance." Jackson ended the call, adrenaline flooding through him as he relayed the details to Lisa and Callum. They quickly regrouped, their exhaustion fading as the reality of the next phase settled in. This wasn't just a rescue operation anymore, it was a mission to uproot the entire network. The drive to the compound was tense. Jackson, Lisa, and Callum rode in silence, each of them mentally preparing for what lay ahead. They arrived just as dawn was breaking, the faint light casting eerie shadows over the compound's imposing walls. High fences lined the perimeter, and guards patrolled with a fierce vigilance. The tactical team, already in position, awaited Jackson's signal. He scanned the area, noting the guards' positions and silently formulating a plan. The compound was a fortress, every inch of it designed to deter intruders. But they had a tactical advantage. They knew where to hit. With a nod, Jackson motioned for the team to move. They advanced in formation, each agent moving with precision, their movements soundless as they closed in on the compound. When they reached the entrance, Jackson and Lisa took point, using the cover of darkness to slip inside undetected. Inside, the compound was labyrinthine, its hallways winding and dimly lit. Jackson and Lisa moved with practiced ease, communicating silently through gestures and hand signals. Callum, close behind, watched their every move, learning from their expertise as they infiltrated deeper into the heart of the operation. As they approached the central chamber, they could hear the low murmur of voices. Jackson pressed a finger to his earpiece, signaling the team to hold position. Through a narrow gap, he could see a large control room filled with screens, each one monitoring different locations and trafficking routes. Men in suits were gathered around a central console, their expressions tense as they coordinated various operations. This was it, the nerve center of the network. Jackson felt a surge of determination, knowing that if they succeeded here, they could cripple the operation's communications and leave the network vulnerable. He gestured to Lisa, who nodded, understanding his plan. They would hit fast and hard, taking out the guards and securing the intel before anyone had a chance to retaliate. With a final nod, Jackson signaled the go-ahead, and they stormed the room. The ensuing fight was brutal and chaotic. Guards rushed forward, but Jackson and Lisa moved like a synchronized machine, each covering the other as they took down opponents with precision. Callum, following their lead, held his own, his training kicking in as he fought alongside them. In the midst of the chaos, Jackson spotted one of the men attempting to destroy the servers, desperately smashing keys to wipe the files. Without hesitation, Jackson crossed the room, intercepting him just in time. He pulled the man away from the console, securing him as Lisa moved to save the files from deletion. "We've got what we need," Lisa shouted over the noise, her voice filled with triumph as she secured a backup of the server's contents. With the last of the guards subdued and the files secured, Jackson took a deep breath, the weight of the mission's success settling over him. The compound was theirs, and with it, the network's primary communication hub. This was the breakthrough they needed, a victory that would send shockwaves through the entire operation. As they gathered the evidence, one of the men they'd apprehended sneered, his voice laced with disdain. "You think you've won?" he spat. "We're everywhere. You'll never take us all down." Jackson's gaze was steely as he replied, his voice cold. "Maybe not all at once, but every time we find one of you, it's another crack in your foundation, and sooner or later that foundation will crumble." The man glared at him, but Jackson didn't flinch. He knew the fight wasn't over, but tonight had dealt the network a significant blow, and he would continue to pursue every lead, every fragment of intel, until justice was served. As they left the compound, Jackson looked over at Lisa, his partner and friend, and saw the same fierce determination reflected in her eyes. Together, they had faced countless battles, each one pushing them to their limits. But this mission, this victory, felt like a defining moment. They were chipping away at something enormous, a darkness that stretched across borders and continents, and tonight, they had brought a glimmer of light to the people caught in its grip. The sun rose over the compound, casting a warm light over the scene as the tactical team began processing the site. Jackson allowed himself a rare smile, a quiet moment of satisfaction, before they began the next phase, one step closer to dismantling the network, one victory at a time. As the sun cast its first light over the compound, the weight of the night's mission lingered heavily in the air. Jackson, Lisa, and Callum took a moment to catch their breath, feeling the exhaustion of hours spent in high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled action. Around them, the tactical team was securing the perimeter, cataloging the mountain of evidence they had gathered. But the victory was bittersweet. They knew this was just one strike in a much larger battle. Jackson surveyed the compound, his thoughts a whirlwind of everything they had uncovered. For every operation they dismantled, there were undoubtedly others springing up like weeds. But this success was a pivotal step, a hard-fought crack in the network's armor. Lisa joined him, her gaze tracing his as she looked over the scene. "Think this will make a real dent?" she asked quietly, a hint of doubt slipping into her usually confident tone. Jackson considered her question, his expression unreadable. "If nothing else, it sends a message. They know we're not going to stop, that we're willing to dig until every piece of their operation is exposed." He looked over at her, his voice steady. "And for the people we saved, it matters. To them, this means everything." Lisa nodded, her eyes softening as she watched the rescued captives receiving medical care nearby. They were exhausted, some looking lost, others clinging to each other as they tried to process the trauma they had endured. One young woman, no older than 20, was seated on the ground, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees as she stared off into the distance, her eyes hollow but alive. She glanced over at Jackson, and for a moment, something passed between them. A silent acknowledgement, a glimmer of gratitude mixed with grief. Just as Jackson was about to turn away, he felt a tug at his sleeve. He looked down to see the young girl from earlier, the one who had led them out of the warehouse. Her gaze was intense, far older than her years, and her voice was steady as she spoke. Will you make sure they can't do this to anyone else?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with an unspoken plea. Jackson crouched down, meeting her gaze with a resolve that was both reassuring and unwavering. "We'll do everything we can," he promised. "You have my word." Her expression softened, and she nodded, as though his promise had given her something to hold on to, a small piece of hope amidst the darkness. Suddenly Callum approached, his face pale as he held up a small tablet that one of the tech agents had found in the compound's control room. "You need to see this," he said, his voice tense. Jackson took the tablet, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the screen. It contained detailed logs, coded transactions, and messages, evidence of a sprawling network with ties that went deeper than they'd realized. But one particular file caught his eye, a list of upcoming shipments, including one flagged with the code Nexus. The name was familiar, one he'd seen in reports of the network's high-value operations. Lisa leaned over his shoulder, her expression sharpening as she read. "Nexus. That's the code name for their biggest operation, isn't it?" Jackson nodded, his mind racing. "If we can intercept that shipment, we might be able to dismantle a key segment of their network." He looked up at Mallory, who had joined them and was reviewing the evidence alongside them. "Director," Jackson said, his voice filled with urgency, "we have to go after this. Nexus could be the lead we've been waiting for." Mallory's expression was tense, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "Then we move fast. I'll coordinate with international authorities to track the shipment's route. You three will lead the mission, but this time, it'll be a joint effort with some of our allies abroad." A flurry of activity followed as the team prepared for the next phase. Hours felt like minutes as they planned and strategized, each agent hyper-focused on intercepting Nexus. They discovered that the shipment was set to move through multiple international waters, a convoluted path meant to evade detection. It would be one of the most dangerous operations they'd undertaken, but they were ready. The following night, Jackson, Lisa, and Callum were flown to a rendezvous point where a coalition of agents awaited them. Among them were seasoned operatives from different countries, each one with their own motivations, but all united in a common goal: to take down Nexus and send a message to the entire trafficking network. The mission briefing was intense, detailing every angle of the plan, every backup and contingency. They would intercept Nexus mid-route, board the ship under cover of night, and secure the cargo. But they were under no illusions. This ship would be heavily guarded, and the traffickers would be ruthless. As they geared up for the mission, Callum, noticeably anxious but determined, approached Jackson. "Sir, thank you for trusting me with this. I know I still have a lot to learn, but I won't let you down." Jackson gave him a reassuring nod, his voice calm and steady. "You've proven yourself, Callum. Just stay focused, watch each other's backs, and remember your training. We're in this together." With a final check of their equipment, the team boarded a stealth boat, skimming silently over the dark waves toward their target. The vast ocean stretched out before them, an endless expanse that seemed to swallow the night whole. As they neared the coordinates, the silhouette of the ship loomed on the horizon, its shadowy form blending into the darkness. Jackson signaled for silence, his mind laser-focused as they approached. They were close now, close enough to see the guards patrolling the deck. The plan was to disable the ship's communications first, preventing any distress calls that could summon backup. In a coordinated sweep, the team boarded the ship, moving like shadows through the night. Jackson and Lisa took point, neutralizing guards with swift, silent precision, while Callum and the other agents followed, securing the lower decks. As they navigated through the ship's narrow corridors, they could feel the tension mounting. Every creak, every shift in the hull was amplified, heightening the sense of urgency. They reached the control room, where the ship's captain and a few key operatives were monitoring the route. Jackson signaled for the team to fan out, each agent taking position as they prepared to breach. The doors burst open and chaos erupted. The traffickers fought back with a ferocity that only the desperate possess, but Jackson and his team held their ground, moving with practiced efficiency. Lisa moved like lightning, covering Jackson as he secured the controls, locking down the ship's navigation to prevent any escape. Just as they were securing the last of the operatives, a voice crackled over the ship's intercom, taunting them in a language Jackson didn't recognize. One of the international agents, a hardened operative named Ephraim, translated with a grim expression. "He's saying this isn't the end, that we're only seeing the surface, that Nexus is bigger than we can imagine." Jackson's jaw tightened as he glanced at Lisa. This network, with all its layers of secrecy and deception, was more than just a single organization. It was a web, tangled and vast, stretching further than they'd anticipated. But instead of feeling daunted, Jackson felt his resolve harden. As they rounded up the last of the captives, Jackson approached a locked compartment, his gut telling him that something crucial lay within. With a final heave, he forced the door open, revealing a hidden room filled with documents, maps, and encrypted files, each one a thread leading to new layers of the network, to allies and accomplices yet undiscovered. Lisa entered the room behind him, her eyes widening as she took in the evidence. "This is it, Jackson. This could lead us to the core." They gathered everything, securing it with a reverence usually reserved for relics. These documents weren't just intelligence. They were keys to unraveling a global system, to dismantling something that had terrorized countless lives. As they made their way back to the boat, Jackson felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, tempered by the knowledge that their work was far from over. They were heading into deeper waters now, with more unknowns than answers. But for the people they had saved and the ones still waiting, they would keep going. When they finally reached shore, the first light of dawn painted the horizon. Jackson looked at his team, a mixture of exhaustion and triumph on their faces, and felt an unshakable sense of purpose. And Jackson knew, with unwavering certainty, that the fight was worth every ounce of effort, every moment of danger. This wasn't just about taking down a single operation. It was about restoring humanity, piece by piece, to people who had been stripped of their freedom and dignity. As the team packed up their gear, Jackson felt the quiet satisfaction that came with knowing they'd made a real difference. Yet, even as he relished the victory, he was already thinking ahead, scanning through the information they'd gathered. Each new file, every encrypted message, every photograph was a new lead, a new opportunity to dismantle the network further. Lisa, noticing the determined gleam in his eye, chuckled softly. "Already planning the next mission, aren't you?" Jackson gave her a small smile, the kind that carried both weariness and resolve. "These people deserve every chance we can give them. And we've got a long way to go. Callum, who had been listening quietly nearby, stepped forward, his expression resolute. Then let's keep at it. I'm in for however long it takes. His voice carried a hint of the youthful idealism that had driven him to join the mission in the first place. But there was something new in his tone now, a maturity that only comes from seeing firsthand the impact of their work. Jackson looked around at his team, the faces of people who had become more than just colleagues. They were partners in this mission, bound by a purpose that extended beyond their own lives. They had shared in the fight, the risk, and now the victory. As the sun continued to rise, casting a warm glow over the quiet shoreline, Jackson took a deep breath, feeling the strength of his conviction settle firmly within him. They had seen the darkness, and they had faced it together. And as long as there were people still trapped in its grip, he knew they would keep pushing forward, no matter how many missions lay ahead. Because with each life saved, each thread of the network unraveled, they were inching closer to a world where freedom and justice prevailed. And that, he thought, was a fight worth every sacrifice. As the team packed up and prepared to leave the compound, Jackson's gaze lingered on the encrypted files they had seized. Each document was a doorway into the dark and twisted web they were just beginning to uncover. While tonight had been a victory, it was only one strike in a battle that was far from over. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with a secure message from Director Mallory. Jackson opened it, his eyes narrowing as he read the contents. The message revealed a hidden layer to Nexus, another high-ranking figure in the network, one who had slipped through their grasp tonight, but was now within reach. The intel suggested that this person, someone who orchestrated the operations from the shadows, was already mobilizing, regrouping to retaliate. The network's most dangerous operatives had gone silent, disappearing from the radar, likely preparing for a counterstrike. Jackson turned to his team, his expression somber but filled with a fierce determination. Lisa looked at him, her eyebrows raised as she caught sight of the message on his screen. "So, it's not over yet," she murmured, the gravity of the situation settling over her. "No," Jackson replied, his voice low but steady. "It's just getting started." He looked at each of his teammates, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. This was more than a fight against a single network. It was a battle against an organization that was resilient, ruthless, and entrenched in places they hadn't even begun to imagine. But with every piece of evidence they gathered, they were getting closer, inching toward justice. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of gold and violet, Jackson knew that the coming days would demand everything they had. The stakes were higher, the enemy more dangerous than they had anticipated. But if tonight had proven anything, it was that their resolve was unbreakable. He looked back at Lisa, Callum, and the rest of the team, their faces tired but resolute. "This is the fight of our lives," he said quietly, conviction ringing in his voice. "And all of this, everything we've done so far, has been building up to something bigger." As they left the compound behind, Jackson's words echoed in their minds, leaving a palpable tension in the air. This was more than just another mission. This was the beginning of a war that would test every skill, every ounce of strength they possessed. Because, as Jackson reminded them, with a final, determined look, this was only the beginning. If this mission has you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Spread the word by sharing this video with your friends and family, and hit that subscribe button so you won't miss what's coming next. The journey is far from over. This is only the beginning.